In this episode, we're going to be talking about one of the newer archetypes, but one of the strongest to date, and that is the Visas Starfrost and its three counterparts that comprise some of the most well-known archetypes, the Scareclaws, Tearlaments, Kashtiras, and the Monadiums. And to keep this episode not running for too long, this episode will establish context and breakdowns of the archetypes for the next video where we break down the actual story. But even before we talk about the archetypes, let's talk about the main character of our story, Visas Starfrost. Starfrost is a level 6 light tuner with 2100 attack and 1500 defense, with a pretty simple effect. While Visas is in your hand, you can destroy one monster you control with a different type and attribute than itself, so any non-light and non-warrior monster, to special summon Visas from your hand. There's also a secondary effect that if Visas Starfrost destroys an opponent's monster by battle, then Visas gains attack equal to half the original attack or defense of the monster. In terms of design, just keep a note of Visas' features like his otherworldly arm, his stat line, as well as the highlights in his hair, as it'll come up later in our identifying features. So let's start with the Scareclaws. This archetype of Earth Beast monsters focuses on link summoning, forcing monsters into defense position. The archetype is divided into two groups, the main deck monsters, which are more support focused, and the link monsters. So let's start with the main boss monster, Scareclaw Tryhard. This is a Link 3 Dark Beast War monster with a standard 3000 attack and has all of its arrows pointing downwards. Tryhard has three effects. The first one is pretty minor, which is that it must be link summoned. The other effect is where Tryhard shows his strength. Then, all face-up monsters in the field are changed to defense position, and Tryhard is unaffected by the activated effects of defense position monsters. So essentially it's a floodgate of sorts, preventing all non-link monsters from attacking or targeting Tryhard for effects. Last is that if Tryhard is in the extra monster zone, once per turn you can target a level 3 Scareclaw monster that's in your graveyard and special summon it. On top of that, when you do, you can add any Scareclaw monster from your deck to your hand. Now, although the Monster Reborn and the Search effect are strong, the true reason why Tryhard is so scary is the floodgate, and that very few cards can deal with such an effect, especially as the other cards the archetype punish your opponent from having monsters in defense position. Speaking of, let's get into them. All of the main deck members of the Scareclaws are Earth Beast monsters that are level 3 and have 0 attack points. They all have the same effects as special summon themselves to the main monster zone adjacent to another Scareclaw monster in defense mode. Then each of the main deck monsters have effects that affect monsters in defense position, like Scareclaw Arco, who lets your Scareclaw monsters in the extra monster zone gain 300 attack for every defense position monster that you control. So with a full field, Tryhard gains 1500 attack points, bringing him to 4500 attack, which is nothing to scoff at. However, on most occasions, you'll just have the 3 main deck Scareclaw monsters, meaning Tryhard will be at 3900 attack points. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Scareclaw Belone gives piercing damage to your Scareclaw monsters that's in the extra monster zone. So on top of the attack boost that Arco provides, the good Scareclaw boy dismantles any defensive monsters that are in Tryhard's way. The only thing that could complete the trifecta and allows the massive damage to be output is if the Tryhard could attack multiple times. Scareclaw Astra is the last main deck monster and is the OTK enabler for the archetype. As on top of the archetypal effect, he allows your Scareclaw monsters in the extra monster zone to attack a number of times equal to the number of Scareclaw monsters you control with different names. With all 3 main deck monsters easily able to special themselves from the hand, 3 attacks with 3900 damage and piercing damage, and unaffected by all non-link monster effects is nothing to scoff at. Unless you run battle traps, which few decks do in the current meta, then you'll have an issue getting rid of Tryhard. It's also worth noting that each of the Scareclaw main deck monsters are based on real fears. Their names alone aren't reason enough, but combined with the artwork and lore, the pieces start falling into place. Scareclaw Arco is based off of Arcophobia, or the fear of heights. This is represented through Arco being the only Scareclaw beast to have wings. Astra is based off of Astrophobia, which is the fear of thunder and lightning, which is seen on Astra with the 2 thunder orbs that are on its back and tail. Not to mention the various surges of lightning coming from the orbs. Last is Belone, who represents Belonophobia, which is the fear of sharp objects like needles, which is the most common example of the phobia. And we see this, like the other Scareclaw monsters, where needles are mounted on Belone's back. The last main deck monster of the Scareclaws is Scareclaw Reinhardt, and is the leader of the Scareclaws. This level 4 Dark Warrior monster has 1500 attack and 2100 defense, and like the other Scareclaw main deck monsters, Reinhardt can special summon itself to a monster zone adjacent to another Scareclaw monster that you control. Then, on normal or special summon, you can add any Scareclaw spell or trap card from your deck to your hand. On top of that, if there are 3 or more defensive monsters in the field, so either yours or your opponent's, you can draw a card too. There are 3 main options for which Scareclaw spell or trap card to add to your hand with this effect. There's Scareclaw Arrival, which is essentially an archetypal monster reborn and can banish itself to protect a Scareclaw Link monster from being destroyed. There's Scareclaw Straddle, which is a quick play that lets you either have your Scareclaw or Visas Starfrost gain attack or defense equal to a monster your opponent controls, or an Omni negate for anything that targets either your Visas or Scareclaw monsters. Or last, the continuous trap card, Scareclaw Splash, which is essentially an auto-negate while you control a Scareclaw monster, and once per turn, lets your Scareclaw monsters attack from defense position. All three are great options and are related to the story, which we'll get into in just a bit. Last, but certainly not least in terms of monsters, is the only other monster of the group, Scareclaw Lightheart. This Link 1 monster with its arrows pointed to the left has 500 attack and requires either one Scareclaw monster or a Visas Starfrost monster. This chibi version of Lightheart is the combo starter and one of the best cards for the archetype. If Lightheart is link summoned to the extra monster zone, you can add one primitive planet Reichphobia from your deck to your hand. Then, if you control a Visas Starfrost, you can special summon Lightheart from your graveyard. Despite how simple the effect sounds, Lightheart is a one-card combo. The last big piece of the Scareclaw archetype is the field spell Primitive Planet Reichphobia. Not only is this where our story starts, but it's a key piece of the Scareclaw archetype. When activated, you can add one Scareclaw monster or Visas Starfrost from your deck to your hand. Then, monsters your opponent controls lose 100 attack and defense for each defensive monster on the field. And lastly, if 3 or more defense position monsters are on the field, you can target one card your opponent controls and destroy it. And all of these effects are on a once per turn. Regardless, the archetypal field spell is the true icing on top for the archetype, and puts Scareclaw as a strong but simple archetype. There are also a couple of important spells and traps for the archetype that both highlight the lore and some powerful effects. Starting with the trap card Scareclaw Alternative, which lets you tribute 3 Scareclaw monsters to force your opponent to special summon monsters in defense position. On top of that, you can banish Alternative from your graveyard for some nice burn damage to your opponent, dealing 100 damage per defensive monster on the field. Which pairs well with Tryhard as he forces all monsters except Link monsters into defense position, so the only out being Link monsters, your opponent can't even summon them. Scareclaw Defanging is a continuous spell card that prevents your opponent from targeting or destroying Scareclaw or Visas Starfrost with card effects. Also, you can banish any monster destroyed by battle with your Scareclaw and Link monsters. And last, you can banish a Scareclaw and Link monster from your field or graveyard to destroy one card your opponent controls. In terms of lore, the basics of the Scareclaws are as such. On the primitive planet Reichphobia, also known as the Fourth Broken World, Reichheart rules over his subjects as the true Beastmaster of the Scareclaw Beasts. Defying his aesthetic and overall intimidating demeanor, Reichheart is a pretty good ruler, and is pretty compassionate towards his beasts. The planet that Reichheart rules is based off of social Darwinism, meaning the strongest survives and is the king of the beasts, so to speak. Day in and day out, Reichheart trains his beasts for the inevitable threat that is coming their way, the Kashtiras. Next up, there are the Tearlaments, our favorite mill deck, fusion-based aqua-type monsters. The group lives on the primeval planet Palorino, or the First Broken World under the tyrannical rule of Rhinoheart, who uses his 3-pronged whip to not only assert his dominance, but to also brainwash his fellow Tearlaments to make sure they're subservient. Rhinoheart, as previously mentioned, is the head honcho of the Tearlaments, and like Reichheart, wasn't a beast type with the Scareclaws, but rather a warrior type monster. Rhinoheart is the same type. Tearlaments Rhinoheart is a level 4 water warrior monster with 1500 attack and 2100 defense. Its effect reads that when it's normal or special summoned, you can send one Tearlament monster from your deck to the graveyard. Then if Rhinoheart is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon it and send a card from your hand to the graveyard. Next up are Tearlaments Havness, Merrily, and Shyren. These 3 dark aqua monsters are the remaining main deck monsters of the Tearlaments. Each have the archetypal effects that if they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can fusion summon using materials from your hand, field, or graveyard, and place them on the bottom of your deck. In terms of specific effects, each of the main deck monsters' effects on top of their archetypal effect mills cards. Tearlaments Shyren can special summon itself from the hand and mill 3 cards. Tearlaments Merrily just mills 3 on summon, and Havness special summon itself when your opponent activates a monster effect and mills 3 cards from the top of your deck. And lastly, at least in terms of monsters for the Tearlaments, are the extra deck monsters, of which there are 3 total. Starting with Tearlaments Kitkalos, a level 5 dark aqua monster that requires one Tearlament and one aqua monster to fusion summon. With a stat line of 2300 attack and 200 defense, you might not expect much. However, its effect is what truly makes Kitkalos such a threat. Even to the point that it is currently in the forbidden list in the TCG. Its effect is that on its special summon, you can add a Tearlament card from your deck to either your hand or send it to the graveyard. Keep in mind that this effect can proc the Tearlament's fusion cards. Also, once per turn, you can target one monster you control, then special summon a Tearlament's monster from your hand or graveyard, and then send the targeted monster to the graveyard. And lastly, if Kitkalos is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can mill the top 5 cards of your deck. So suffice to say, Kitkalos is a phenomenal extender of the archetype. But what makes it such a threat is that Kitkalos evolves once more into the level 8 Rukalos. With a typical boss monster stat line of 3000 attack and 2500 defense, you'd be surprised to know this isn't the real boss monster of the archetype, but we'll get into that in just a second. Rukalos needs to be fusion summoned by using Tearlament Kitkalos and any other Tearlament monster. While in the field, other aqua monsters you control can't be destroyed by battle. Additionally, once per turn, at the cost of sending a Tearlament's card from your hand or field to the graveyard, you can negate and destroy one of your opponent's effects that includes a special summoning of a monster. And lastly, if a fusion summoned Rukalos is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon it once more. Now, the evolution of Kid Kalos into Root Kalos has some lore explaining the evolution. Essentially, prior to Rhinoheart's rule, the main deck Tearlaments monsters were in their strongest forms. But when Rhinoheart came, he stripped them of the power so that he could stay as the ruler of the broken world. But that changes in the story. The last and true boss monster of the Tearlaments is Tearlaments Kaleidoheart. This level 9 Dark Fiend monster has both 3000 attack and defense, and requires a fusion of Tearlaments Rhinoheart and 2 Aqua monsters. This represents Kaleidoheart drawing in and using the power of the other Tearlaments monsters to strengthen himself. The boss monster on special summon, or if an Aqua monster is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can shuffle one card your opponent controls into the deck. And its last effect is that if Kaleidoheart is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can send a Tearlaments card from your deck to the graveyard and then special summon it back. Although there are a good couple of spell and trap cards of the archetype, their card artwork depicts a lot of the lore regarding what happens in the primeval planet Pellerino. So without spoilers, let's talk about the spell and trap cards of the Tearlaments. The primeval planet Pellerino is the field spell of the archetype, or at least one of them. When activated, you can search for a Tearlaments or a Visas and add it to your hand. If your Tearlaments monster is shuffled into the deck outside of the damage step, you can destroy one card in the field. There's Tearlaments Grief, which is a spell card that lets you special summon a Tearlaments or Visas Starfrost from your deck at the cost of sending a monster you control of the same type or attribute of the special summon monster to the graveyard. Tearlaments Heartbeat is a quick play spell that lets you target either a spell or trap on the field and shuffle them into the deck at the cost of sending one card from your hand to the graveyard. This effect increases to 2 cards if you control a Visas Starfrost, and if Heartbeat is sent to the graveyard, you can add a Tearlament trap card from your graveyard to your hand. Tearlaments Perlegia is a field spell that lets you Foolish Burial another level 4 or lower Aqua monster when another Tearlaments monster is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. There is a caveat to such a strong effect, however. If you send a non-Tearlaments monster card this effect, you can't activate the effects of those sent cards. Tearlaments Scream is a continuous spell that lets you mill the top 3 cards of your deck if a monster is no more special summoned while you control a Tearlaments monster. And if Tearlaments Scream is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add a Tearlament trap from your deck to your hand. Tearlaments Meta Noise is a trap card that lets you change a monster your opponent controls to face down defense position if you control a Tearlaments monster. It also lets you Foolish Burial another Tearlaments monster from your deck. If the trap card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add back a Tearlaments monster from your graveyard to your hand. Tearlaments Crime is a counter trap with an Omni Negate that shuffles the card back to the deck. The cost of such is needing to control a Tearlaments monster, as well as sending a monster from your hand to the graveyard. Additionally, if Crime is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add back a banished Tearlaments monster to your hand. And last but not least is Tearlaments Suliak. This continuous trap allows you to target and negate your opponent's monster effect, and also send one monster you control to the graveyard as long as you control a Tearlament monster. Additionally, it's a search for any Tearlament monster if it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect. The Kashtira are a deck that is focused on banishing your opponent's cards face down and locking them out of zones. The Kashtiras inhabit the pressured planet Wraithsoth, the 6th broken world, and is ruled by an Iron Fist of pure power, Kashtira Riseheart and his lieutenants, the other Kashtira monsters. The Kashtira main deck monsters each have a search effect as well as an effect to banish a card face down when either they battle or a monster effect is activated by your opponent. The field spell, the Pressure Planet Wraithsoth on activation, searches for a Kashtira monster. Then, monsters you control gain 100 attack per different attribute on the field. Last, if the Kashtira Shangri-La activates its effect outside of the damage step, you can destroy one card on the field. The Kashtiras are the quote-unquote bad guys of the Visas story, despite the leader of the Kashtiras being a version of Visas himself. Either way, they are the main antagonists, and Riseheart is aware of the other versions of Visas and intends to capture them before he gets absorbed. The level 4 Fire Warrior monster is a key support for the other Kashtira monsters. While you control another Kashtira monster, you can special summon Riseheart from your hand, although this locks you into Xyz monsters for the rest of the turn. That's exactly what the Kashtiras are built for, as the Kashtiras are the XC variants of Visas. The same way the Scareclaws are the Link versions and the Tearlaments are the Fusion versions. Continuing with the Riseheart's effects, during the main phase, if Riseheart is summoned this turn, you can banish the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck face down for the cost of banishing a Kashtira from your deck. If this effect goes through, Riseheart becomes level 7, which conveniently is the level of the Riseheart's true form. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the other main deck Kashtira monsters. There's the Brute of the Kashtira, the Water Psychic level 7 monster, Kashtira Ogre. With a well-off 2800 attack points, Kashtira Ogre can special summon itself from your hand if you control no monsters. On a once per turn cooldown, Ogre has 2 effects. First is that you add a Kashtira trap card from your deck to your hand. Then, if Ogre declares an attack or your opponent activates a monster effect, you can activate the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck and banish one of those cards face down. Next up is the Scout of the Kashtiras, the Wind level 7 Kashtira Unicorn. The 2500 attack point psychic monster can special summon itself if you control no monsters and has a once per turn clause on its effect. Like Ogre, during the main phase, you can add a Kashtira spell from your deck to your hand. Then, if Unicorn attacks or if your opponent activates a monster effect, you can banish a card face down from your opponent's extra deck. Unlike Ogre, Unicorn is one of the more used Kashtira cards, as the archetypal spell cards are pretty strong and are great extenders for the archetype. The last of lieutenants is Kashtira Fenrir. This level 7 psychic earth monster follows the trends of the other Kashtira monsters. It can special summon itself from your hand if you control no monsters, and can add a Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand once per turn. And if Fenrir attacks or a monster effect is activated, you can target a face-up card your opponent controls and banish it face down. Kashtiras only have 2 extra deck monsters within the archetype, but they are some of the strongest out of all of the Visas Starfrost cards. Kashtira Shingra-Ira is a Fire Psychic Xyz with a surprising 0 attack but 3000 defense. Requiring 2 or more level 7 monsters, Shingra-Ira is meant to be a zone-locking Death Star. Kashtira monsters can get beamed down from the Death Star, as during each standby phase, you can special summon a Kashtira monster from your deck. The real damage comes in Shingra-Ira's second effect, which each time a card in your opponent's possession is banished face down, you can lock your opponent out of a monster or a spell and trap card zone until Shingra-Ira leaves the field. On top of that, the Psychic monster has some built-in protection, as both those previous effects don't require you to detach a material. If Shingra-Ira would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can detach material from the card instead. Like the Death Star, this is what the other Visas Starfrost variants fear, as the Kashtiras travel to other planets and dominate them using Shingra-Ira's immense power. The last of the Kashtira monsters is the powered-up form of Riseheart, Kashtira Riseheart. This rank 7 Dark Machine Xyz monster requires 3 level 7 monsters as materials, but most of the time you won't be using 3 level 7 monsters. Rather, a Riseheart can be Xyz summoned once per turn by using a Kashtira monster you control if the effect of Shingra-Ira was activated successfully this turn. So once the damage has been done with Shingra-Ira, then a Riseheart comes in to finish the job. When he arrives, things get bad for those who stand in his way. He has 3 additional effects. First is a Macrocosmos type Floodgate, meaning any card that is sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Second is that once per chain, each time a card is banished, you can add one of the banished cards as material. And what does a Riseheart do with all these accumulated enemies that he's taken over? Well, he releases a devastating attack. By detaching 3 materials, you can target and banish a card face down. And before we end this section on the Kashtiras, let's go over the remaining cards in the archetype, the spells and traps. Starting with Kashtira Preparations. This continuous trap lets you special summon a Kashtira monster from your hand or that is banished during either player's turn. Then if you control a Kashtira monster while Kashtira Preparations in your spell trap card zone, you can banish a card from your opponent's hand. Kashtira Big Bang is a normal trap that has the effect that if your Kashtira Xyz monsters in the field and a player controls 2 more monsters, they must banish face down monsters so they only control 1. Then a Big Bang is banished, you can add any Kashtira Xyz monster from one of your Xyz monsters to your hand, and then you can special summon it. Kashtira Overlap is a quick play spell that lets you target 1 monster and banish another monster from anywhere but your deck that has 1500 attack and 2100 defense, which if you've been paying attention is any of the Visas variants. The targeted monster then gains 1500 attack points, which is pretty impressive for an attack point gain card. Then if Overlap is banished and you control a Kashtira monster, you can negate the effects of 1 monster your opponent controls. Kashtira Birth is a continuous spell that lets you normal summon level 7 monsters without tributing, and during your main phase you can special summon a non-Xyz Kashtira monster that's banished or in your graveyard. On top of that already great effect, if your opponent activates a spell or effect while you control a Kashtira monster, you can banish 3 cards face down from your opponent's graveyard. Kashtira Extra is another quick play spell that has the effect that if your face-up Kashtira Xyz monster is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish a Visas Starfrost from anywhere except the graveyard, and then cheat out a vicious Astrolabe from your extra deck, which is another important lore-related card, but we'll save that for when it shows up in the story. If Extra is banished, you can target a banished Visas Starfrost and add it to your hand. And last, and most known of the Kashtira spell and trap cards, is Kashtira Theosis. It lets you special summon from your deck a different attribute Kashtira monster than you already control at the cost of locking you to only Xyz monsters for the turn. Then, if the card is banished, you can add back to your hand another Kashtira card that's banished. Kashtira Theosis is a 1-card combo right into Kashtira Shingra-Ira, which lets you go into a Riseheart once his effect is activated. So, suffice to say, Theosis is one of the strongest cards of the archetype. Now, the stage is almost set for our story to take place. We still have 1 more archetype and the full story to cover, but because this video is taking so long, we'll cover the Monadiums in the next video.